This is about William Howard Day, Underground Railroad commander. William Howard Day is one of the few colored men in this country who was capable of appreciating the anti-slavery cause. The distant civil rights advocate, W.E. Du Bois, once contended, indeed, the movement was too fast to be comprehended by the majority of the people. It is assertion claiming there was a component of the American abolitionist movement that has been distorted and misrepresented over the course of modern history. The reality of W.E. Du Bois' 1950 conclusions troubled me. It would have certainly struck a chord with the most Underground Railroad operatives, mainly William Howard Day. To know Day was to become acquainted with the problem of the 19th century, the crisis of the fugitive slaves, and the Civil War that followed. Born free in New York City to a father who fought in the War of 1812 and a mother who escaped from slavery and co-founded AME Zionist Church, Day grew up as a newspaper publisher, an iterative preacher, and a school board president in several northern states before the Civil War. At age 3, Day's father, war hero, died when he fell from a ship in Lower Manhattan. At 12, his brave mother gave him up to adoption to a white family that owned both a button factory and a newspaper, The Herald, in Northampton, Massachusetts. After being refused an admission to Massachusetts' popular Williams College, Day enrolled in Ohio's Auburn College, where he graduated top of the class in 1847. Then he worked as a composer on several newspapers, including the Orleans El Evangelist and the Cleveland's True Democrat. In 1852, he organized abolitionists all over the state into the Ohio State Anti-Slavery Society. Less than a year later, he set off on his own and launched his first and the state's first black-owned anti-slavery newspaper, which he entitled The Alien American. The newspaper comported of himself as administrator of the race who faced troubled fate when he was destined to lead. For that very reason, most free blacks looked to him for direction. Day's popularity propelled him into leadership of the Ohio Underground Railroad. He used his office of the Alien American in Cleveland as his headquarters. The Underground Railroad, or the UGRR, is often defined as a borderless, timeless network of safe houses and abolitionists who organize a complex system of secret routes between slave and free territory using code words and symbols, ultimately ended up in Canada. The definition is often accompanied by a map of escape routes pointing out different directions, heading to spots north through New England and south to the south, Florida, and New Mexico. Albeit since the introduction of slavery in Americans during the 16th century, runaway slaves had escaped to such location, but re-examining the recent historiography will not consider the explanation part of the Underground Railroad, rather an organized effort to assist fugitive slaves. The one that emerged during William Howard Day era was never quite about its intention to help slaves achieve freedom. This underground operation is a story about fight, not much about flight. The Underground Railroad has its start and finish in 1833 to 1861. It has borders that are restricted to northern states. Plus, it was a far-reaching political movement with prime intention to start a war that could end American slavery system. Instead of being a covert operation, the Underground Railroad was a metaphorical term used to torment the South. Anti-slavery activists like Day publicized their success in helping runaway slaves and protecting free blacks during the year before the Civil War, then used their newspaper to gloat to the Southern slave owners about their success. While secrecy was essential, the Underground Railroad was no secret at all. Although it would be a waste of time to study the code words, phrases, and others remiss to search the cubby holes and tunnels, the real story about this political movement lies in the courage of its operatives who openly defied the federal statutes. Designed to help slaveholders recapture runaway slaves, in his autobiography, The Distinguished Escaped Slave, Frederick Douglass sneered, "I have never approved of the very public manner in which some of our Western friends have conducted what they call the Underground Railroad, but which I think, by their open declaration, has been made most emphatical, the Upper Underground Railroad." Douglas's Upper Ground Railroad somehow became Du Bois' story that has become too vast to comprehend. The phrase Underground Railroad should be thought of as a nickname used by northern abolitionists to goad southern slave owners, not as a term to describe something that was secret. The term highlights the importance of geographical features. There could be no Underground Railroad until actual railroad was a part of the American framework. Thus, there could be no railroad moniker until the early 1830s, when the Iron Horse was introduced in American society. Moreover, than 30,000 miles, that is 70% of the Alabama Railroad track, existed in the American North. Therefore, although slaves fled in every direction, there could not be an underground railroad until there was a steam-powered locomotive railway until it became an official part of the political movement, and until it was exclusively focused on the ambitions of the North. By 1833, the medical phrase put a thumb in the eye of Southern slave owners. The phrase reappeared on October 14, 1842, in addition to William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. Drawing on Charles Dickinson Garrison in the 1836 novel The Pickwick Papers, the paper reported that Sam Weller is requested to tell the slaveholders that he passed 26 prime slaves to the land of freedom last week, and several more this week thus far. The Liberator boasted. All went in by the Underground Railroad. This is the moment when the expression was forever bound into the spine-crackling annals of an anti-slavery movement. Vigilante committees were the centerpiece of the Underground Railroad. They made up of free black abolitionists who criticized the weak stand of anti-slavery society has taken against the fugitive slave crisis. These committees were extremely organized and militant. Each of those had an ad hoc group based in the city or town or black neighborhood that comprised a large number of free black residents. The first vigilante committee in the North was David Ruggles' Vigilante Committee of New York City. Founded in 1835, Ruggles' group was a standard bearer for future generations like the Vigilante Association of Philadelphia, operated by William Steele 2 years later. Likewise, other northern cities had vigilante committees. Boston African Americans formed the League of Freedom in 1850, and in 1852, William Howard Day and African American residents in Cleveland, Ohio, formed the Committee of Nine. Typically, black neighborhoods in the free North were the single reason why vigilante communities were able to function. Places had their largest free black populations were hotbed for runaway slaves. Most in the Chesapeake region around southeastern Pennsylvania and Maryland and along the Ohio River Valley of Ohio. The racial demographic was suitable for escaped slaves. According to the 1860 National Census Survey, roughly 500,000 free blacks live in the United States. Half live in the upper northern states, while the other half live in the territory of the upper south. The nominal numbers of free blacks living in slave states, Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky, made it easier for free fugitive slaves to find their way to a free black community along the southern borders of Pennsylvania and Ohio. From there, runaways can walk, ride, or sail from one black neighborhood into the south into another in the north. The free black corridor of Chesapeake region in the Ohio River Valley were epicenters for the Underground Railroad. In black neighborhoods, community leaders often worked as barbers, teamsters, teachers, and business owners, and in the case of William Howard Day, a newspaper publisher. Day used his newspaper, The Alien American, to raise money and provide legal counsel and offer a place to live, a job, and financials to a fugitive slave. Soon, articles began appearing in the anti-slavery press that infuriated the South, like one that appeared in The Liberator, which announced 24 men from a southern plantation passed to Mechanicsburg, Ohio, on the Underground Railroad in one night. The publication of the successful flight of 24 fugitive slaves and a single escape was a sign that Day's Underground Railroad operation in Ohio was leaps and bounds ahead of the slave-catching ventures of the South. Cases like those frustrated pro-slavery sympathizers. The stories motivated Southern elected officials in Congress to strengthen the outdated slave law. The opportunity to nationalize the slave issue arrived in the summer of 1850 as the crisis of the over fugitive slave reached a volatile level. Congress compromised a new federal legislation and aims at slowing down the pace of the slaves' escapes. In September, the new slave law established a national system of slave catching that was seen as a new force against abolitionists. The first stipulation provided the appointment of a federal commissioner over judicial power to act like any justice of the peace or any magistrate in the United States to preside over the case regarding fugitive slaves. The United States Commission on Slavery was given the power to issue affidavits to the claimants, arrest, imprison, and on a rule on bail. A slave commissioner had the power to appoint a deputy marshal with full power to overturn the fugitive slave as to the claimant. Finally, the federal slave commissioner had the power to convict anyone aiding and abetting a fugitive slave in a fine of $100 or 6 months imprisonment. As an incentive for the slave commissioner, the fugitive slave law made it mandatory that the claimant pay him a fee of $5 for simply arresting the fugitive slave and $10 if he ruled in the return of the fugitive. However, the fugitive slave law failed to dent the Underground Railroad momentum in a way pro-slave proponents had desired. Rather, it strengthened the organization of the movement. Federal legislation motivated more citizens to resist slavery and inspired original leaders of the Underground Network to work more assiduously by concentrating and increasing media outlets and raising more money and endorsing Canadian refugee settlements by using more physical resistance against slave hunters. Following William Howard Day, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 brought in the impact of slavery evils closer to the home state of Ohio. Like most vigilante committees, the highest priority of the Underground Railroad that Day headed was the epidemic of kidnappings. In the case, William Lewis demonstrated far too sadly the dilemmas of which Day had to struggle. Sometimes before 1853, William Lewis had escaped from Kentucky and settled in a free black neighborhood of Cincinnati. Williams left his fiancée behind when he made a decision to run away. He still wanted to marry her, but was unsure that he would ever see her again. So Williams sought insight from a fortune teller. The psychic asked him where he was born, and during the course of their conversation, she realized that Williams was an escaped slave. When he left, she contacted Williams' former master, who promised to pay her $100 if she helped capture Williams. She accepted the offer, and just days later, Williams was arrested and brought before the Federal Slave Commission. As soon as the Vigilante Committee in Cincinnati heard the tragic news, one of the city's underground leaders, William Troy, sent word to William Howard Day in Cleveland. Day gave Troy some money to hire a popular anti-slavery lawyer to defend Williams, and the two men came up with an extraordinary strategy to steal Williams from his captors. Troy was assigned to lead a group of abolitionists inside the courthouse intending to overcrowd the courtroom. The group was given orders to disrupt the legal proceedings, while Day agents planned a rendition of William Lewis out of the courtroom. Troy admitted there was a man in our company who looked very much like the prisoner complexion, and it was arranged that he should occupy the prisoner's place temporarily while he should put his own hat upon the prisoner's head, thus allowing him to make his way to freedom. The overcrowded courtroom and the consistent outbursts between the lawyers made it easy for Troy to give Williams the wink, slip the hat on the defendant, and get the fugitive to crawl out of the courtroom on his hands and knees. By the time the prosecution team realized that Williams had slipped away, it had already been too late. Arrangement had been made to disguise Williams as a woman and dress in a dress, in a bonnet, and a veil, and usher him to Day's office in Cleveland. 3 weeks later, Williams walked officially into the editorial room of the Alien American. Day then put Williams on a ferry and escorted him across Erie Lake to Canada. In a short time after William Lewis' case, articles about the escape and large numbers of runaway slaves began appearing in anti-slavery media. In May, the Frederick Douglass newspaper wrote, "The directors of the Underground Railroad reported to us the passage through our city last Monday of 41 human chattel from the land of the slave whip and the coffee of the pillage to the North Star." A few months later, the Cleveland Herald wrote, "The Underground Railroad never hit a more thriving business than present." Within 10 days, the Herald reported that Cleveland abolitionists had agreed no less than 26 refugees from slavery, not one of whom had met any difficulties making their way into Canada. The large number of the refugees to Canada West was already being increasingly noticed by the early 1850s. There continued to be a steady stream of immigration from the United States to this place. The Canadian anti-slavery newspaper, the Provincial Freeman, boasted, "Knowing the Underground Railroad, every train brings along new and capable passengers from the Underground Railroad, full of glory and ready to work. Reaching Canada through RUGRR terminus in Cleveland was a common thing in the middle of the decade where citizens called fugitives freedom seekers." The Toronto newspaper, the Voice of the Fugitive, reported that a fresh lot of freight had just landed here safely today from the state of Kentucky. They were all hearty and stout men who had unspeakable joy to meet two of their old friends aboard the ferry boat that departed from Cleveland. The Voice's editor, Henry Bibb, also reported news of a slave owner being wiped clean of all his enslaved persons. Bibby wrote, "A woman so enraged that her 2 eldest daughters were sold into the deep South, escaped with 8 of her children and 1 grandchild, and arrived on the last chain. They ran away from Rice Bones of Dover, Kentucky. They were all slaves which he possessed. 10 fugitives gladly arrived in Canada." The volume of escaped slave stories reported by the anti-slavery press and how organized a coalition of Underground Railroad activists were thoroughly through the North and South, the North being the operative word, especially in the story of William Lewis. The Underground Railroad disposed primarily as a northern operation. The Underground Railroad kept vigils for intruding slave hunters to keep looking for kidnappers of free black persons. In the case of a runaway slave, the decision to flee the plantation or the urban household was left up to the enslaved person. Upon their arrival in a northern state, when the Underground Vengeance Committee kicked in, it helped the fugitive slaves settle. In either cases, the Underground Railroad were defiant to the federal law and worked awfully hard to agitate the South by reporting such things in their weekly newspapers. Northern citizens were simply observers and soon recognized the success of those working the Underground Railroad were having. A person who identifies himself as an Ohio Columbian wrote, "The Underground Railroad has never have been in a more hopeful condition. The fugitive slave law has raised the stock of some of our western tracks at least 50 to 70%. Acknowledging the Underground Railroad expansion across William Howard Day region of Ohio, he continued, some of the new tracks have lately gone into successful operation. The old tracks of Underground a thorough repair. The Underground Railroad between Day Committee meeting in Cleveland and Ambilish in Canada was moving along in full throttle. At the end of the summer of 1856, William Lloyd Day Howard Coalition published his activity, the Frederick Douglass paper. Between the months of May and August, Day Vigilante Committee spent $309.37 to the spirit of 176 fugitive slaves to Canada. Day provoked the South further with the metaphor. Lately, he said, we have paid $59.73 for which we receive a large sum of $35,000 according to the way by the American people to buy and sell God image in the southern states. Day's quarterly report showed that his committee had 220 courageous operatives who were ready to help and a total sum of $19.31 left available to spend. We therefore resolve, wrote Day, as a committee of men, never to take down our flag while the Underground Railroad cars should move on invisibly, for God is on our side. How did Day's committee get away with such illegal activity? To break the federal law and then publicize it in insubordination risks heavy fines and time in prison. The answer helped to offer a fresh perspective in seeing that the Underground Railroad as a political alternative to the abolitionist movement. Perhaps the best instrument used by those aiding runaway slaves for the protection of state personal liberty laws. As early as 1920, the personal liberty laws were passed by the state legislatures in the North Free State to protect free black residents from kidnapping. It also protected abolitionists who refused to help slave catchers capture fugitives. Essentially, people who can affirm through personal liberty law and presumption that all people are free and that people should secure basic liberties, namely trial by jury, a verdict of not guilty to be final and conclusive, and a right to an appellate process. Essentially, all people can, right to the appellate process. And any person who wrongfully arrested for another, being a fugitive slave, was fined between $2,000 to $5,000, and then now of the country or the state in prisons used to detain the fugitive slave. The prohibited is the state police were taking part in arresting an alleged fugitive. In other words, personal liberty laws were enacted in Northerners to claim states' rights and nullification of the 1850 fugitive slave law, which had in effect frustrated Southerners who had the federal law on their side. As the Civil War approached, Day felt pressure from several different directions. In 1858, he had taken the underground operation to Chatham West, present-day Ontario, to organize the Underground Railroad Vigilante Committee in that city. Near Chatham was thriving yet underfunded refugee slave settlement known as Buxton Mission. There, David taught the fugitive slave kids. Meanwhile, insurrection was bubbling in the United States. White abolitionist John Brown was taking steps to attack Harper's Ferry in an attempt to seize weapons and use them to liberate slaves in Virginia and wage war in the slaveholding South. In April, 6 months before the feudal raid, John Brown traveled to Chapman and paid Day $30 to print his provisional constitution and ordinance for the people of the United States. For the next month, Day worked in 8x8, looking a little 8x10 shanty across the Canadian line, where he printed on a hand press and reading the matter that John Brown later circulated around Harper's Ferry. When finished, Day had hid the parchment in the flour barrel and shipped it to John Brown Man in Iowa. Emboldened by his role as a printer, William Howard Day was content with the capacity of his contribution. Although greatly motivated to be involved in the radical side of the Underground Railroad, Day recognized that he had other important obligations. And armed combat was not the typical political affidavit that he long advocated. He expressed to John Brown that he had no interest in joining the raid on Harper's Ferry. Nevertheless, he would sustain admiration for Brown's unmistakable commitment to the freedom struggle. With connection with John Brown was most intimate in Knowledge Day, so much so for the 3 weeks before the Harper Ferry incidents, we ate, drank, and slept together. The Buxton Mission was struggling to keep up with the stream of fugitive slaves. The settlement was in need of money to build a new church and 4 additional schoolhouses. In June 1859, the mission's founder, Reverend William King, was to head to Ireland and go on the first leg of a fundraising campaign. He asked Day to go with him. King, who had confided in Day very early on endorsing his appointment as an elder at the Presbyterian Church at Buxton, always looked at him as a right-hand man who could play a vital role in compelling the new projects at the settlement. After several invitations from the friends on other sides of the Atlantic who had visited the settlement, King explained, with Day's help, King wanted them to visit and deliver a few lectures, and the pair could raise money, the sum the King wanted. To sustain the refugee slave settlement, King and Day had to take fundraising to the next level. The next level meant that two of them had to reach beyond American and Canadian contributing base. When John Brown's army reached the small army upon Harper's Ferry in the fall of 1859, Day and King had already departed for Dublin. They spoke in front of the Irish General Assembly, the Metropolitan Hall of Dublin, and the Vice-Regal Lodge of Dublin, the present-day residence of the President of Ireland, and Rosemary Street Presbyterian Church in Belfast. Their speeches were covered by Ireland's majority media market, including all the newspapers of Dublin. The media coverage was, of course, the best publicity and making it known to other cities. Our mission was well known, they gloated. They went to other cities and got good audience. The men together raised almost $7,000 for the Buxton mission. There in the British Isles, they remained until Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation filled millions of slaves in the United States. The ambition of slavery was not to end the Underground Railroad, and Day did not abandon his interest in the freedom movement. It is important for us to take a look at the Underground Railroad as a political campaign and not a story about quilts and candles and code words, because if that's how it's perceived, one missed the pivotal role played by foot soldiers like William Howard Day. Without Day's unheralded heroism, there had been no effective alternative for the freedom movement. The political wing of the Underground Railroad deserves its place alongside the slavery question as the primary cause of the Civil War and the launching pad to the Civil Rights Movement. Ultimately, we must conclude that William Howard Day's actions provided an alternative that can help us comprehend and appreciate this type of Underground Railroad that W.E. Du Bois later described as too vast for most to understand. So that's about the ancestor, William Howard Day. He done a lot more than that. You know what I'm saying? The political question goes a lot more deeper because this was a spy unit too also during the war through the underground trails and stuff like that. Maybe come up in the next video, I don't know. You know what I'm saying? We're going to go with that because he don't do this man much justice. He used to debate General Gerald Massey. Look that up. Anyway, subscribe to the channel. Much love to y'all. You know what I'm saying? And we're going to keep it popping, keep it moving. Peace.